On the 1st of May, 1986, thousands of children walked through the center of Kyiv. The air above them that morning carried radiation roughly 100 times above normal. The men who organized the parade knew that number. They had it on paper, and they sent the children out anyway. They wore matching tracksuits, they carried paper flowers and red flags, and they smiled for the cameras because they had been rehearsing this for days. 5 days earlier, 90 kilometers to the north, Reactor Number 4 at the Chernobyl power plant had exploded. The wind had just turned south, toward Kyiv, a city of 2.5 million people. The man in charge of Soviet Ukraine, Volodymyr Sherbitsky, had pushed Moscow to cancel the parade. Moscow refused, so Sherbitsky did something that tells you he believed the danger was real. He showed up to the parade in person, and he brought his own grandchildren to stand beside him. My name is Tom, your host from Forgotten Europe. Almost everything you have heard about Chernobyl is about the reactor, the explosion, the firefighters, the empty city. None of that is what this video is about. What happened in the 5 days after the explosion is a different kind of story. A government already knew how dangerous the air had become and decided the priority was keeping that fact buried. How they did it, what the surviving documents reveal, and why none of it was panic or confusion. It was a decision. At 1:23 in the morning on the 26th of April, 1986, Reactor Number 4 exploded. 2 blasts tore the 1,000-ton lid off the reactor and threw burning graphite into the night sky. 4 kilometers away, in a city called Pripyat, 50,000 people were asleep. Some woke up. A few stood on a railway bridge to watch the strange white-blue light over the plant. And almost all of them are believed to have died for it. The bridge is called the Bridge of Death now. Pripyat was 3 years younger than most of the people in it. A model city the Soviet Union built in 1970, average age 26, with a cinema, a hospital, and an amusement park whose yellow Ferris wheel was scheduled to open in 5 days, on the 1st of May. None of them knew that the air had already changed. 36 hours. That is how long the official position of the Soviet state was that nothing was wrong. This was not a failure of information. By the morning of the 26th, the plant's own instruments were off their scales, fires were burning in the reactor core, and the most powerful man in the country, Mikhail Gorbachev, had been woken before dawn and told there had been an explosion. The information existed. It traveled up. What did not travel was any instruction to protect the people living 4 kilometers away. A government commission was assembled in Moscow and flown south that same day, headed by a deputy prime minister named Boris Shcherbina. So the men with the authority to act were standing near the burning reactor within hours. They could see the glow, and still the city below them was not told to move. You can measure that silence in how ordinary the day below them looked. It was a warm spring Saturday, and Pripyat spent it outside. Parents wheeling strollers along the river, children fishing in the cooling channel that ran from the plant, sunbathers on the rooftops who would later remember the strange tan they got that weekend. None of them had been given a reason to go indoors. The decision was not stuck in some distant ministry that failed to grasp the danger. It was being made by people close enough to feel the heat, about people they could almost see. And here is what makes it worse. They were not paralyzed by confusion or panic. There was a reason they did nothing, and it is colder than incompetence. Soviet regulations from 1963 said that a civilian evacuation was only required once a person's accumulated radiation dose reached 75 Röntgen. In Pripyat, the daily intake was estimated at around 4.5. By that arithmetic, the legal threshold for acting was still days away. So the commission's senior medical officer, a man named Yevgeny Vorobyov, would not take responsibility for ordering an evacuation. The radiation was rising. The rule said, wait. He waited. That is the engine of this entire story. No one in that room had to believe Pripyat was safe. They only had to believe the paperwork was not yet complete. The system did not require a liar. It required officials who would do nothing until a number on a form told them to. And the form had been designed 23 years earlier to be reached slowly. And so the weekend was allowed to continue. There is film shot in those days, and on it you can see small white flecks flickering across the picture. That was not dust on the lens, and it was not a fault in the camera. It was the radiation itself, striking the film the way it was striking the people who had not been told to go inside. 36 hours. That is how long the most ordinary Saturday in Pripyat's history was allowed to continue, because no one with the power to stop it was willing to be the one who did. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon on the 27th of April, 36 hours after the explosion, the radios in Pripyat's kitchens finally came on. A calm woman's voice read an announcement. There had been an accident at the Chernobyl power station. Radiation conditions in the city were deteriorating. Residents should bring their documents, some essential belongings, and a small amount of food. They should switch off their lights and water and close their windows. They should remain calm and orderly. And this was the word that mattered. The evacuation would be temporary. It was not temporary. The operation itself was fast and, on its own terms, efficient. More than 1,100 buses had been assembled in a column stretching down the road from Kyiv. In a few hours, 47,000 people were loaded out of Pripyat and driven away. They took a change of clothes and their papers. They left dishes in cupboards, photographs on shelves, toys on the floor. Many left pets, having been told they would be back in 3 days. The pets were later shot. The cruelty of that announcement is hidden in one word. It was not a lie in the crude sense. There had been an accident. The conditions were deteriorating. Those words were true. The lie was the smallest, most deliberate word in it: temporary. One word, chosen so that 50,000 people would walk to the buses calmly instead of running, would lock their doors instead of grieving, would leave the dog a bowl of water for the weekend. The state had stopped pretending nothing was wrong. It had simply moved on to managing how wrong people were allowed to understand it to be. And while those buses pulled out of Pripyat on the 27th, two things were already in motion that would decide how this story is remembered. 1,100 kilometers to the northwest, in Sweden, the needles on a radiation monitor were starting to move. And 90 kilometers to the south, in Kyiv, a city of 2.5 million people was being prepared for a parade. While Pripyat was being emptied, 90 kilometers to the south, Kyiv was rehearsing. The 1st of May was the most important day in the Soviet calendar, International Workers' Day, the day every city in the Union put its loyalty on display. Kyiv, the third largest city in the Soviet Union, staged one of the largest parades of all. And in the last days of April, while the reactor burned and the wind began to turn south, the preparations went ahead exactly on schedule. On the 27th, the 28th, and the 29th of April, school children were brought out in tracksuits to practice their routines in the open air. The same days, the radiation over the city was climbing. Not everyone in charge wanted this to happen. Volodymyr Sherbitsky, the head of the Communist Party of Ukraine and the most powerful man in the Republic, understood what was drifting toward his capital, and he pushed for the parade to be canceled. The answer came back from Mikhail Gorbachev's leadership directly. The parade would go ahead. To cancel it would be to admit in front of the whole world that something had gone catastrophically wrong, and the official position was still that it had not. A canceled May Day parade in Kyiv would say more than any Western news report could. So the parade was not canceled. It was protected. And this is where Sherbitsky's choice tells you everything. He could have sent a deputy to the reviewing platform. Instead, he stood there himself, with his grandchildren beside him, in plain view of the crowd. And that was not an act of courage. It was the most effective propaganda available to him. A leader does not put his own family in poisoned air to fool the public. He does it to fool them more completely. If the man at the top trusts the day enough to risk his own grandchildren, what is an ordinary parent supposed to think? The children at the front of those columns were the message. His were the proof. So on the morning of the 1st of May, 1986, the parade went ahead. Tens of thousands of people moved through the center of Kyiv in long columns. Workers, students, families, children at the front, carrying flowers and flags, and portraits of the men who had ordered them there. They sang, they waved. Photographs from that day show a bright, ordinary, sunlit holiday. The radiation in the streets that morning was many times above normal. Every person in those columns was breathing it, and the ones who arranged for them to be there had known for 5 days what the air was made of. I have read a lot of official decisions from this period of the Cold War. Of all of them, this is the one that stops me cold. Not because it was the most violent, but because it was the most deliberate. No one in Kyiv on the 1st of May was caught off guard. The danger was understood. The order was given anyway. And the thing chosen to be protected was not the children in the square. It was the story. There is one part of this the Soviet state never had a chance to control. Radiation does not respect a border, and it does not wait for a press release. On the morning of the 28th of April, 2 days after the explosion, 3 days before the Kyiv parade, a chemist named Cliff Robinson was finishing his breakfast at the Forsmark nuclear plant on the coast of Sweden, 1,100 kilometers away. To get back to his work area, he had to pass through a radiation monitor, the kind every worker walked through a dozen times a day without thinking about it. The alarm went off. He assumed it was a fault. He checked a colleague's shoes, then his own, then others. And the readings were real. The contamination was being carried in on the soles of people's shoes, from outside, from the air. Forsmark's first assumption was the obvious and terrifying one. The leak was theirs. They evacuated around 800 workers to an assembly point and began tearing through their own plant looking for the source. They found nothing, because the source was not in Sweden. Swedish scientists ran the isotope signatures, traced the wind backward over the previous days, and reached a conclusion that must have been difficult to say out loud. The radiation was blowing in from inside the Soviet Union, and there had been no announcement of anything at all. A country had suffered a major nuclear accident and said nothing, and the first the world heard of it was a beep on a Swede's shoe. That was the moment the cover-up failed. Not through a confession, not through a leak, but through physics. Sweden confronted Moscow with what it had, the isotopes, the wind data, and made clear it would take the matter to the world. On the evening of the 28th, the Soviet news agency TASS finally read a statement on the air. It was about 20 seconds long. It said an accident had occurred at the Chernobyl power station, that one reactor was damaged, that aid was being given to those affected, and that the situation was under control. Read the timeline back slowly, because this is the part that matters. The world outside the Soviet Union learned that Chernobyl had happened on the 28th of April. The people of Kyiv marched through the contaminated streets of their own city on the 1st of May, 3 days later. By then, the secret was already out everywhere, except the one place it was being most carefully kept, at home, from the people it was actually killing. For years, all of this could be waved away as confusion, a slow system, a bad night, mistakes made under pressure by frightened men. The reason we no longer have to be generous about it is that the paperwork survived, and the title of this video is a promise I intend to keep. When the Soviet Union opened its archives, and when journalists like Alla Yaroshinskaya recovered the classified Politburo protocols in the early 90s, a different picture came out of the files. These were the minutes of the secret commission that managed the disaster, many of them stamped as a single copy, never meant to be read by the public. They show a leadership that was not confused about the danger. It was specific about it, and specific about how much of it to admit. But the most damning files are not from after the explosion. They are from before it. In recent years, Ukraine's security service has declassified hundreds of KGB documents on Chernobyl, going back to the plant's construction in the 1970s. They do not read like the record of an accident waiting to happen by chance. They read like a warning that was filed and filed and filed again. As early as 1978, KGB reports flagged violations in the construction work that could cause emergencies once the reactors were running. A report from October 1984, 18 months before the explosion, summarized the engineering faults of the Chernobyl units and singled out structural and design flaws. There were smaller incidents, including a release of radiation in 1982, that the public was never told about. Moscow was informed, in writing, that this was one of the more dangerous plants in the country. None of it reached the people who lived next to it. So when the explosion finally came, the silence that followed was not improvised. It was the same reflex the system had been practicing for a decade. The reflex to file the danger upward and tell the public nothing. April of 1986 was not the moment the cover-up began. It was the moment it stopped working. The post-explosion files then record what that reflex did under pressure. They document decisions to raise the officially permissible radiation dose for the population on paper, so that fewer people would legally require evacuation or treatment. They record what was known about contamination in food and milk, and what was withheld. And in Ukraine, the archives include reporting from the Republic's KGB chief, Stepan Muka, on the mood in Kyiv, and the handling of foreign visitors against the backdrop of the May celebrations that were going ahead regardless of the radiation levels across the Republic. There is one more detail in the record that I cannot read neutrally. The same authorities who sent tens of thousands of ordinary people into the streets of Kyiv quietly reduced the number of participants brought in from some districts by as much as half. They thinned the crowd where they could do it without drawing attention, which means they were not gambling that the air was safe. They were doing the math on how many people they could expose without the absence becoming visible. That is what the files prove. Not frightened men losing control of a situation, but careful men deciding, line by line, how much of the truth their own people could be allowed to survive without. The cover-up did not end in April. It was only on the 25th of August, 3 months later, that Soviet representatives sat down with the international community in Vienna and disclosed the real scale of what had happened. By then, the damage was inside people. The children of 1986 grew up, and a portion of them carried the consequences in their bodies. A documented rise in thyroid cancer across Ukraine and Belarus among those who had been young that spring, many of whom never knew, on the day it mattered, that there had been any danger at all. Chernobyl is often described as the accident that helped bring down the Soviet Union. What actually cracked the system was not the explosion. It was the discovery, by its own citizens, of how completely they had been lied to in the days that followed it. I want you to picture, one last time, the morning of the 1st of May, 1986, in the center of Kyiv. A bright spring holiday. Columns of people in their best clothes. Children at the front, carrying paper flowers, waving at the men on the platform. One of those men had tried to stop this, had been overruled, and had answered the order in the only way the system left him, by placing his own family in the same air as everyone else's, so that no one would think to be afraid. Everything in that scene looks like an ordinary parade. That is exactly what it was built to look like. The radiation was the only thing telling the truth that morning, and it was the one thing nobody in the crowd could see. If this story stayed with you, you will find more like it on this channel. Forgotten Europe, places where the official record is the calm surface of something much darker underneath. Subscribe if you want the next one when it goes live. I am Tom. Thank you for watching.